Welcome to EV Hub Live. EV Hub Live is a live video podcast for public policy professionals working to advance transportation electrification. EV Hub Live is recorded live, so to tune in and ask questions or check the schedule, please visit atlasevhub.com/live. In this episode of EV Hub Live, Nick Nigro will sit down with transportation policy guru Dan Sperling, the founding director of the Institute of Transportation Studies at the University of California, Davis, and member of the California Air Resources Board. We'll discuss the implications of the election on state ZEV programs, federal policy, and other key policies and programs related to EVs, and hear where Dan thinks things are going over the next year as state legislators and governors get going, Washington receives a new Congress, and a new president is sworn in. This episode is produced by Peter Benzoni and Connor Smith of Atlas Public Policy.
All right, thanks, Peter. As usual, I'm Nick Nigro, and welcome to EV Hub Live. I'm very excited today to be joined by Dan Sperling, a guy that I really look up to in the transportation space. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you, Nick. Thank you for the invitation.
So as part of prepping for this one, I rewatched your Daily Show interview something like 11 years ago with Jon Stewart back then. And I'll have to say that it's pretty clear from what we were talking about then that EVs have come a long way, for sure. It was also kind of funny at the end, Jon ended the interview by saying, eventually we'll get it right. And so 10 years later, I feel like we're starting to approach that period of eventually. So let's talk about the election, or at least the results of the election on EVs and transportation electrification. We have an EV-friendly White House once again with President-elect Biden. The Trump administration had spent considerable time rolling back vehicle standards and trying to strip California of its authority to regulate emissions. So can we give us the audience a sense of how far they got with that, and what can we expect from a Biden administration out on the gate?
Well, from an electrification perspective, Biden is fabulous news because, first of all, as you were just saying, Nick, the Trump administration did roll back the greenhouse gas standards for vehicles, and they, as well as the CAFE standards, fuel economy standards, and took away authority from California to impose a zero emission vehicle mandate and other kinds of emission standards and emission rules. Mm-hmm. And so now I've seen the marching orders from the Biden administration already to EPA, and it is to get rid of that, to give back California's waiver immediately as a first priority. Mm-hmm. And it's important because it's not just California. There's many other states that are following California. So we're talking about 30 to 40% of the U.S. market.
Right. So how far did the Trump administration get in terms of that rollback, and how long do you think it will take for the Biden administration to kind of essentially get us back to where we were in 2016?
Well, they didn't. So the zero emission vehicle program, we can just continue. It's in place just the way it was. But we had planned to make it much more aggressive, much sooner. Mm-hmm. And so now we're going to have to just start that regulatory process now. But it takes several years to actually put that in place. That's for the electric vehicle part of it. And we definitely need to come back to that. But in terms of the greenhouse gas standards, what happens there is they did roll it back. And so now the Biden administration has to decide, are they going to start a new rulemaking process to reinstate or increase them for the interim years, or will they just have a new standard that they will go forward on adopting for 2026 and beyond? And there is actually another avenue there that hasn't been discussed a lot, and that is California signed an MOU with 5 of the major car companies, right, where they agreed to follow a new set of requirements that were just slightly less aggressive than the so-called Obama standards. Mm-hmm. And so there is a possibility that that could be codified nationally,
Mm-hmm.
which is probably, from a environmental perspective, would be the best thing possible.
So is that what you recommend they do in the near term, is try to look at codifying that agreement?
Yeah, so it would be three parts. One is give California back its authority.
Mm-hmm.
Number two is start a process to increase the greenhouse gas standards in 2026 and beyond. And three, what we're just talking about, somehow figure out how to take that MOU and make it national.
Okay. And so we're just talking about passenger vehicles now. We'll get to trucks in a bit. So that would kind of help us hopefully make up for some lost time here in terms of increasing electrification. Tell us a little bit about how you feel the ZEV program looks moving forward. You sitting as a member of CARB, of the Air Resources Board, you have a unique perspective on that. And we've had some states, for the first time since I can remember, at least, more states have been signaled that they're joining. Washington, Colorado, a few others are considering joining the program. So is that still, you think, a linchpin for electrification in the near term, or what?
Yep, I think that's it.
Okay.
Because the existing ZEV mandate is not very strong.
Mm-hmm.
It only requires somewhere around 10, 11, 12% of vehicles to be electric in 2025. But we're in California, we already hit 8, 9, 10%.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not a big deal at all. But what's going to be a big deal is the next round. Mm-hmm. So now now we're empowered to go ahead and I guess, we usually have to, the state law requires that we have a lag time when we're imposing new regulations on the industry. And I think that's 3 years. So realistically, we can't really get anything in place until 2025, 2026. Mm-hmm. But the plan is, as you know, Nick, our governor issued an executive order that all light duty vehicle sales will be zero, which includes, by the way, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, mm-hmm. but that all new light duty vehicles will be zero emission by 2035. So CARB is now going to kick into high gear, developing the regulations for, going from where we are to 100% in 2035, and hopefully all these other states will follow along. So that's a big part of the market, and that's a big number. Yeah, I would not, certainly on a national level, we could never expect 100% ZEVs by 2035. Mm-hmm. So that's why the state initiative is really important.
Okay, so the states are going to continue to provide some of the leadership, or at least some of the forward thinking on how to get more ZEVs. Let's talk a little bit about a national ZEV program. There was, back a few years ago, General Motors was advocating for one. It was probably weaker than what California was going to be doing anyway, but they
much weaker.
Yeah. So they wanted to do something like that. Do you see the Biden administration considering that as a floor, essentially, from the national perspective?
Well, the Biden administration, what they've said is they're very focused on electrification. Mm-hmm. The House Select Committee on Climate Change had ZEVs and, electric vehicles at the top of the list. But this is, the Congress didn't turn out the way that, some would have hoped. Mm-hmm. And so I think there is a real question whether they can get a ZEV mandate through the Congress.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Now, there is a possibility it could be done through the Clean Air Act. So this is that big overarching question about, where the presidents issue executive orders and use administrative action. And there's been more and more of that in recent administrations, and right. Lots of criticism of that by many, but yet that is a tool. And so the Clean Air Act is very powerful and provides the possibility of doing things administratively.
And so how would you gauge that versus other activities you mentioned they have to do, like revisiting the greenhouse gas standards, NHTSA's fuel economy standards. Where's that national ZEV fit in that order of operations? The three things you said they have to do right away.
Yeah, we've been having many of us have been having lots of conversations about exactly that topic. And so the question is, who knows how this is going to play out? I mean, no one knows, including President Biden, President-elect Biden. But we have this situation where we could really ramp up the greenhouse gas standards for vehicles. And if you make them aggressive enough, then that essentially is good enough to force the car companies to be selling electric vehicles. And in fact, that is what's happening in Europe. So Europe does have very aggressive standards on cars. The CO2 greenhouse gas standards on cars are much more aggressive than ours. And the result of that is all the car companies are making massive investments in Europe to roll out electric cars for Europe. And VW is at the top of the list, but all of them are doing that. And so if we could imitate that, then the ZEV mandate becomes less critical. My personal take on it is that's a really heavy lift.
Yeah.
But maybe if we did it in some kind of incentive-based way, so now we're getting a little wonkish here, but okay. I love policy wonkishness.
Yeah.
So one of the things you can do with these standards is you can make them aggressive, but then set them up so that if you do electric vehicles, there's a multiplier and you get lots of credit. So you could say these greenhouse gas standards are going to increase 7% every year. So the Obama standards were 4 to 5% a year.
Right.
Okay, you make it 7% a year, but then you say, okay, but if you sell an EV, you get, it counts as 0 grams per mile, and it counts as 2 vehicles.
Okay.
And we did do something like that early in the Obama standards as well. So, I mean, if we could pull that off, but the other idea of the ZEV mandate is, I just don't think we can get a strong ZEV mandate through. But maybe we can get a weak one through, and maybe that's good enough. I don't know.
It sounds important from a national market perspective. If you want to make sure that the vehicles are getting sold in all the states and not just targeted in the states where they kind of have to be sold, it sounds like some kind of floor would be helpful. Is that kind of what you're saying?
That is kind of my take on it, but others worry about the backlash, and it uses up political capital and so on, and maybe it's not worth it. But I do look at it, if California, as California goes towards its 100%, and if most of those other states follow, it's 9, 10, 11, 12 states follow, accounting for 35% of the market, then the car companies start looking at this and saying, well, wait a minute, we really don't like these patchwork approaches, and it just creates headaches for us. And maybe there's some kind of compromise in there. At the end of the day, this is a global, at least when you look at it from a climate perspective, this is a global problem. So California, the attitude in California should be, and I think it mostly is, that we want to be a leader and model, but we don't want to get way out front if no one's going to follow us. There's no value from that.
So we've been talking a bunch about passenger cars. Let's talk about trucks too, because there was a big splash, I think, in July in California about trucks and buses, big targets there, new rules from CARB. Tell us a little bit about that, how we see other states potentially following suit. There was an MOU that came out right afterwards with 15 states saying they wanted to work on electrifying trucks and buses, something like getting all of them electric by 2045 in terms of new sales. Peter's showing a map right now of these are all the states that signed that MOU. Tell us a little bit about that rule and what we can expect from it.
This rule is in some ways even more surprising and just really amazing. 2 or 3 years ago, none of us would have conceived of doing a rule like this. So let me tell you what this rule is, how really amazing it is. It is, what it does is it requires, so we adopted, this is an actual regulation requirement in California. So we adopted it in June, we, the California Air Resources Board, in June, a few months ago. And what it says is that almost all trucks, almost the entire truck market, 75% of sales must be electric or hydrogen fuel cell by 2035. And so when I said almost all, so it also says that for the long haul tractor trailers, they have to meet 40% requirement by 2035. And then there's a few others that have a little smaller too. But it's mostly, for the most part, it's 75%. I mean, you know, that's just mind-boggling.
Yeah, I wonder if you would have brought that up as a goal when you were talking with Jon Stewart 11 years ago.
Oh, he would have laughed me out of the room, you know? Yeah. Really. I mean, any of us. And it's just because battery costs have come down so fast, it's so much, and all the projections are going to continue coming down. So let me finish this on trucks, and then I want to talk about this cost idea a little bit more. So California already adopted this regulation. So what happened, this MOU, is all these other states are saying, we're really interested in doing the same thing as California, imitating it. And so the way it, you know, going back to what the feds do in the Trump administration, is the way that rule works, the authority of California works is California can adopt any emission standards for vehicles as long as they're more aggressive than a national standard, than an EPA standard. And then, so that was the original rule. And then later Congress said, the Clean Air Act was amended and said, not only California, but any other state can choose to follow either California or EPA. And so over time, more and more have started following California. So that is, you know, a real, and so now that authority will be given back, and so we're going back to where it was before. So this is, I mean, if you think about it, trucks, we have 75% of trucks electric in 2035. I mean, you know, cars, we don't have anything even close to that. Now we are going to, in California, we are going to, you know, the plan is to do 100% cars by 2035, but that's not in place, and it's going to take a few years for that. So the truck story is actually leaped ahead of the cars.
And this is just new sales. This isn't right on the road, right? Yeah.
This is new sales. Yep. And so the truck, and you know, what's really interesting about it is we got relatively little pushback from the truck companies when we adopted this rule. I was very surprised. You know, usually you expect, you know, they come up one after another, tell us how stupid we are and we're making a mistake, and and they bring up all the people that you know, from all different groups, you know, the different chambers of commerce, different church groups, you know, to criticize it. And we heard very little of that. So I think what's going on is even the truck industry now is recognizing that they are going to electrification. And, you know, they're not quite sure how this is going to play out. There's, you know, fuel cells are likely to play a big role in it, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And there'll be some plug-in hybrid trucks too. But certainly some trucks, like local delivery trucks, you know, like, you know, the Amazons and FedEx, UPS trucks, they just...
That new Ford Transit vehicle that just got announced today. I mean, that's exactly what you're talking about.
Exactly. You know, those are almost no-brainers because they only go, you know, 100 miles a day or so. So you don't have to put a big battery pack in, and you do the cost calculation. You know, the return is like 2 or 3 years for a lot of those trucks, you know, because they get a lot of miles, but don't go very far. And they go back to a central depot often where they can be charged up. So the economics look great on those.
So it sounds like a positively developing story for trucks and buses, which is good. And a lot of that's driven through something like the ZEV program for trucks and buses. What we take a step back and look at what other things we can expect from states in the near term on EVs and transportation electrification. broadly, it's not just going to be mandates, right? They're going to have to do other things. They've got incentives in place in some states. A couple of states like New York and California even have truck incentives. What other programs, policies are you going to be on the lookout for in the near term, not just in California, but elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a good question, because we hear back from the car companies and the truck companies. When I say truck companies, I mean truck manufacturing
Mm-hmm.
companies. And they tell us, you can't make us sell vehicles
Right.
that no one wants to buy.
Exactly.
And they're right,
Right.
And so we do need this whole ecosystem of policies and strategies and incentives to make this work. And there's a real responsibility. And California's done a pretty good job on that. Many of the other states have not done quite as good a job. So I think a lot of states really have to step up in terms of their commitments. And so, the question is, what does that mean? And it is, so it's you're making sure charging infrastructure is there, hydrogen stations are there, making sure there's incentives for the buyers, because even for those trucks, even though the rate of return, the return is pretty quick, it's something new. If you're a fleet, you don't like to change stuff, right? It's a whole new way of behaving. You have to worry
Mm-hmm.
about charging. So even though the economics look good, they still need a little prompting, a little incentive to, push them forward.
Yeah, no, the infrastructure costs are, kind of could be vast, especially if you don't have an engaged electric utility. And electrifying, one or two vehicles as a demo project is a big difference than electrifying an entire depot, right?
So let me actually just list a bunch of things, and you can
Yeah.
follow up
Okay.
what you want to. Okay, so actually for the trucks, one of the things we're doing is going to adopt a fleet purchase requirement. So
Mm-hmm.
that means that, this is essentially guaranteeing a market for the truck manufacturers.
Mm-hmm.
And we're telling the big fleets that you need to increase your purchase of zero emission vehicles over time.
So you've got a program that requires the manufacturers to essentially build the vehicles, make them available for sale. And on the other end, you've got a program that's saying your fleet purchasers have to purchase a percentage of these.
Right.
Okay.
So you can't do that on the car side
Right.
because most cars are owned by individuals,
Mm-hmm.
but you can do that on the truck side.
Mm-hmm.
So we're doing that. So that rule is in process. It should be adopted sometime next year. You need incentives. So one thing California does is we have this cap and trade program, and we use some of that money as incentives for buyers of electric vehicles. We have another program, a low carbon fuel standard, that imposes a requirement on oil companies to reduce the carbon intensity of their gasoline and diesel.
Mm-hmm.
And if they don't or can't, they buy credits from others. And so the electric utilities that are selling low carbon energy to vehicles, we're packaging all that together to create another incentive package that actually is going to be announced formally in just a few days. So I'm getting ahead of it. You'll see that coming out next week.
Breaking news.
Breaking news.
Yeah.
And that'll be about $1,500 per vehicle
Mm-hmm.
purchased. We in California, we have electric vehicles can use the carpool lanes. That's a non-monetary thing that works well. On chargers, we're getting, we're through the PUC prompting the electric utilities to invest more. And we are putting some money into fast chargers also. Those are the kind of major thing. And then requirements for government fleets also to buy vehicles.
So let's talk about a little bit more on infrastructure, and then I'm going to turn to an audience question on low income households. If other folks have Q&A that they questions they want to ask, you can just enter them on the Q&A box there. So on infrastructure, the business model is still difficult, selling electrons for transportation, especially in the public. As you know, you got a really engaged PUC in California. We've got very engaged PUCs in most parts of the country at this point. But you can only go so far, I think, with just utility engagement. You need other things too. You mentioned LCFS. Could you tell us a little bit about programs like that and how they improve the kind of business case for charging?
Yeah, well, the I mean, part of it is just like you said, it's almost impossible to make money selling electrons to vehicles because you're not selling many of them and you're doing it slowly. You know, gasoline, you fill up a gas tank in 5 minutes, 3 minutes, and you put more energy in those 3 minutes than you do in, you know, hours with a charger.
Mm-hmm.
And even a fast charger, you know, it still takes 45 minutes or so to get a full charge. So we need to somehow figure out how to get those chargers out there, and the electric utilities are an obvious candidate. You know, we made a mistake in California in the beginning where we banned the electric utilities from setting up charging stations, and
Mm-hmm.
we just thought everyone's going to want to sell electrons and get into the business. Well, we didn't really understand the business very well at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So that rule's been changed. But they have a real benefit from selling electricity. One, it's one of the few ways they can really increase their market a lot, and the other is it helps them balance their load. They can, you know, use different ways, incentives, and different ways of overseeing the charging so that people charge off peak, and it flattens their load, and so it makes them much more efficient.
Mm-hmm.
But electric utilities are not the most innovative industry, you know, in the world. So, you
Well,
know,
they're a heck of a lot more interesting than they used to be. I will say, when I
correct.
was coming out of undergrad as an electrical engineer, the last place I wanted to work was the power company.
Yeah.
You know, that was not the cool place to work. They've definitely come a long way. So let's pause and just summarize here for a sec. You know, we talked about President-elect Biden and how, you know, he ran, climate was right up there as the top of an issue, and justice was also an issue. We see states continuing to lead, and it sounds like you're expecting them to move forward with more programs. Are you seeing the states as being the ultimate leaders in the near term in EVs from this policy perspective, or do you think that we're going to see more activity from Washington, and there's going to be they're going to be a player again?
Well, I do expect at the federal level them to be more of a player than in the past, but I do think the states in the near term are going to be leading. Now,
Mm-hmm.
having said that these are not in the next few years because we've got these regulations in place and it takes time. So we're really talking about 2025, 2026,
Right.
where it's going to really ramp up. You're going to see these, you know, sales go up like that, and the
Mm-hmm.
requirements and the incentives and the charging. But it is, you know, kind of unfortunately, it is going to be a little slow the next few years.
Well, so let's talk about political will and motivation for a second, particularly around justice and underserved communities, disadvantaged communities. This is from a question from our audience about EVs. What became evident with COVID is, you know, areas where there's a lot of pollution, where it had disproportionate effects from COVID because people have other respiratory issues, so they're more susceptible to these to COVID. They also are more susceptible to other respiratory issues, and so that's a motivator, I think, for investment in those communities to decarbonize, essentially, and to reduce local air pollutants in particular. And you know, that's EVs. So tell us a little bit about what the scene looks like in California, particularly around getting either consumers to get into EVs if they're in these communities, or just to decarbonize them because that's where, you know, freights are operating, ports are operating, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so there's two parts to it because one is the truck side and the other is the car side.
Mm-hmm.
So on the truck side, you know, in many ways that might be the most important because a lot of these neighborhoods that are underserved, overburdened, are located near the ports,
Mm-hmm.
near rail yards. They're warehouse and distribution centers that are now proliferating everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them have older trucks operating and high emissions. And so these neighborhoods really are impacted. And it's not just the pollution, it's the noise, it's the safety, you know, these big trucks running through these neighborhoods. So as we electrify, we do have another program in California to try to help these overburdened environmental justice communities. And so we're going to, in some cases, try to reroute trucks away from neighborhoods and so on. So I think that's where the big benefit is going to be. On the car side, in many ways, it's more complicated because almost all new cars are bought by relatively affluent people. Something like a third of the households buy almost all new cars, and something like 6% of households buy a quarter to a third of all the cars. And so low-income people don't buy new cars. I mean, 2/3 of the population buys used cars. And this is not just low-income people. This is middle-class people too. And so how do you deal with this? I think part of it is we want to create incentives for the used EVs to make it into these communities. So right now, all the incentives are for new electric vehicles. The other thing we can do is get them into these neighborhoods in terms of as electric, in terms of car sharing programs and ride sharing programs. And there are some innovative ideas, not just ideas, but pilot projects going on where you can get local people to, they get access to these electric cars, and then they can use it as kind of a ride-hailing car locally.
So speaking of ride hailing, let's talk a little bit of mobility. I didn't want to pass up the opportunity to let you talk about three revolutions too. So in California, you had Prop 22, which was pushed by Lyft and Uber to try to set the standard for how their drivers are treated from a labor perspective. Some people are upset about that. Some people are happy about it. I think these companies, with the passage of it, they want to try to look at that as a national model. Tell me about what your thoughts are, maybe not about the labor issues, but more about efforts to decarbonize these vehicles and what that market looks like from a broader transportation perspective.
Yeah, so these ride-hailing companies are struggling also, like a lot of other companies now, with the pandemic. But they have, both Uber and Lyft have made very aggressive commitments to electrification. And I forget the details of it, but I think Uber said all vehicles would be electric by 2030, and Lyft something similar to that. And they do make the caveat that they need help from government, to do this. They can't do it completely on their own. And that means in terms of incentive programs and so on. And so I think they're on board to do it. Now, the state also, just to push it a little more aggressively, and California, the state of regulation, right? We have a new regulation coming. I know all my.
I used to live there, so I can laugh at that. Go on. Yeah.
I know it. There is this tension between how do you pursue these causes that are in the public interest, and yet do it without harming business at the same time, chasing away jobs and business, and that's a never-ending tension. So without getting into the philosophy of regulation, what we're doing is another regulation called the Clean Miles Standard.
Right.
And this is the California Air Resources Board, and we're basically setting a requirement for what we call these TNCs, transportation network companies. And so that's Uber, Lyft, but there's a fair number of other ones as well. Uber and Lyft are the biggest. And we're saying that every year, the way it's set is grams per passenger mile. I really like that, because this is a requirement that just says, we're not going to tell you exactly how to do it. We're just saying, reduce the carbon intensity of your travel, of your trips, of your business. And so they can do it by electrifying their vehicles. It's not their vehicles, that's part of the complication. They can do it by reducing the deadhead time. So about a third of the time these cars are going around without passengers in them. So how can you shorten that amount of time,
Mm-hmm.
make them, and of course they're interested in that because it makes them more efficient as well, and drivers like it too. And a third strategy is you can get more people into the car, and that way you reduce, if you have two people, you only have half as many grams per passenger mile. So all those three are part of it. The focus is on electrification, but those other two options are available to them as a way of meeting this standard. And I think I like it not only because it's something that could be replicated elsewhere, but eventually we want to do something like that for all cars. I mean, the real challenge here is single occupant vehicles. And my Uber and Lyft friends tell me that all the time, right? They say,
Sure.
we're not the problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's that other 99%.
Mm-hmm. But so, do you see other states kind of following suit with looking at these ride hail emissions more directly? And, with the fact that the labor issues being sorted now in California, do you see that also kind of coming along for the ride essentially?
Yeah, the labor issue is for any politician, that's the more salient concern and issue.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very legitimate one. So just for your listeners that aren't from California, maybe I'll just do a real
Mm-hmm.
quick overview. So California passed a law over a year ago that essentially says that all part-time contract workers, all companies must convert all their part-time contract workers to be employees. There are certain tests that determine when, but it's pretty broad. And so right away, lots of different groups started saying, well, wait a minute, this doesn't work for us. Screenwriters, hairdressers, all kinds of groups. And so then at the same time, Lyft and Uber and several other companies said, this really doesn't work with our business model at all. They said, but what we'll do is we'll guarantee a minimum wage, we'll guarantee some funding for health insurance and some other provisions to help out the drivers. And so they put a ballot on a proposition on the ballot, and they spent massive amounts of money, and they won. And so now they are exempted from that law.
Mm-hmm.
But the real point of that is, I think that, okay, so I'm not an expert at labor law, and I know we weren't going to go into labor law here, but, clearly it's not working. So many people in this country work in these kinds of contract employee, temporary things, short-term things, and the so-called gig workers. And we need to come up with a way to protect them. And we don't. We have a very bimodal system, and either you're an employee or not. And so we need ways of protecting all those people. So I think what Lyft and Uber did is actually a model. I don't know. I mean, certainly it can be tweaked and improved, but it provided a third way. And I think that's what other states are going to be looking at, and who knows, maybe even the feds. But I think the clean mile standard idea is going to spread also because, a lot of big cities especially are concerned about, I mean, if you're going to be serious about climate, let's look at it across the board. And even though they're only, 1% of the problem, 1% of passenger travel, hopefully, okay, my three revolutions, you said that. Okay, so the three revolutions idea is that vehicles of the future could be automated, electric, and pooled. And I happen to think that's by far our best strategy for creating sustainable transportation. Because until then, everything's at the margin. Land use is hard, conventional transit is hard. And so, but if we make it automated and pooled, that's the key idea, then we have an opportunity to reduce the cost. It becomes a way of serving a lot more people. It becomes an equity strategy. You serve a lot more people at a lot less cost,
Mm-hmm.
and they're electric. So seems like heaven to me.
Sure. I think you have a book about it. So just wrapping up this talk of states, you mentioned equity. So I got to ask you one other question about it. Whether you are a technocrat or an environmentalist, there are a variety of reasons why people got into EVs many years ago. We were looking to deal with climate change. People were interested in energy security. I think what takes up a lot of my time now, in many of our times, and I'd like to hear your perspective, is equity and justice and disaffected communities who are disproportionately affected by emissions or other factors from transportation. So tell us about how that is, changing your thinking about policy and what considerations you need to make as a member of the board and CARB, but also as a leading transportation policy advocate.
Yeah, there's two parts to it. One is the pollution impact, and I mean, partly in transportation, we're at fault because we were party to the redlining, we were party to building freeways through these neighborhoods. We devastated all these communities and neighborhoods all around the country. We've underfunded transit, so we've done we have done a really poor job, and basically we've marginalized such a big part of our population. So, and I say that in the sense that partly they are affected by the pollution, and we have as I talked about earlier, you got these big old diesel trucks going through neighborhoods we've had people living near ports because there was a lot of redlining going on, and it affected where people could live. And so it's really horrendous what we've done on that count. And it was a mixture of racism. It was a mixture of, just taking advantage of people that had less power, running these freeways through these neighborhoods. And, so a lot of sad stories there. So here we are now, I think, by cleaning up our vehicles, by just our new cars and trucks are amazingly clean burning. Even the diesel ones are really low emission. So even just getting more of these cleaner buses and trucks out there really helps these neighborhoods a lot. In fact, all the modeling we're doing, we see that for many of these neighborhoods, the air pollution improves fairly significantly in the coming years, just because all these old trucks are getting off the road. But the other part that really gets me more in what I'm focused on more and more is that we have marginalized so many people, and it's partly a racism thing, it's partly a low income, it's partly physically limited people. If you have a car-centric transportation system and you can't drive, or don't have the money, or physically can't, you're really disadvantaged in our society, in our economy. And so I think a big thrust of what we need to be doing is figuring out how to provide more accessibility and mobility to these different underserved communities. And that, by the way, is one of the reasons I get excited about this idea of pooling and automation, because transit is expensive. In dense corridors, it works well. But once we get away from that, we need something more. I mean, after all, transit only serves 2% of passenger miles in this country. And there's a whole lot more than 2% of people that are marginalized and disadvantaged by our car-centric transportation system. So, just getting transit back to where it was is not good enough. We need to do much more.
Well, so let's turn back to Washington, where I live, where the transportation system's, pretty good, relative, at least from a transit perspective, and talk a little bit about what we can expect, maybe from the Congress as we close out. President-elect Biden campaigned, mentioned 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations a lot, talked exactly about what you were saying, electrifying transit modes, particularly in rural areas, and even a kind of modern cash for clunkers program. I don't want to necessarily end on a sour note, given where we think Congress might be going. But what do you think is possible, either from stimulus in what would be a priority, I guess I should say, from your perspective about where they should put investments in the near term if they were going to do something out of the Congress?
Well, there's a question of what could they do and what should they do.
Start with what should they do?
Let me back up to preface this a little bit more on all the electrification ideas, is that, this electrification strategy, and I know that was, Nick, that's your favorite topic, and that's the theme here. Electrification is becoming so compelling, and it's certainly compelling in terms of it's by far the best strategy to reduce greenhouse gases from transportation, but it's compelling economically in ways that, I was just hinting at before. We're starting to see that, if we follow a fairly significant ramp up of electric vehicles, cars and trucks, within 5 to 10 years, most vehicles will come out ahead on an most electric vehicles will come out ahead compared to gasoline or diesel on a total cost of ownership basis. And that's an important metric. That means that, we don't need $2 trillion for transportation. We need just to get this thing started, and then our economy and our society are going to benefit greatly from electrification. So electrification really has to be a top strategy for how to move it forward. And just because the benefits are so huge. So the other part of it is, I do think, so the charging, that's why charging is important. Most people now charge at home most of the time. And so, and that's going to go on for a while because, most people, as we said, are more affluent and have houses and have a place to park their car and charge. But they do need it for psychological reasons, need to know that the charging stations are out there. And then as we move towards apartment buildings and multifamily dwellings, and lower income neighborhoods, we need to get public charging out there. So supporting it, I don't know exactly the best way to do it. We've kind of started out that way. Help the electric utilities, make sure there's a competitive environment, but provide some kind of funding, especially, and for fast charging. Actually, these Lyft and Uber, if they're going to go to electrification, they need fast charging. These drivers, every minute is money, and so if they have to sit there for 4 hours to get charged up, that doesn't make sense. So they got to have fast chargers out there. And in fact, most of those drivers live in low income neighborhoods. So putting the chargers in low income neighborhoods is actually a good thing for all of the ride hailing. So that's the ride hailing part of it. And, I think that's really where those are the two big things.
So what would you do if you could advise senators and congressmen on what would be the priority in 2021 when you look at, we've got to get this economy back. We've got too high unemployment. Too many people need work. Let's make some public investments. Where should they put those dollars right now?
Okay,
so to talk about the politics of it.
Yeah.
That's not our area, but what should they do?
Well, the other part of it is the transit part of it. And I get, this is probably the most controversial, and at least for me, the most difficult one to deal with, because our transit systems are in desperately bad condition. They've lost so much of their riders, their revenue is down. And now with the pandemic, we're telling them they need to spend more money on cleaning up, their vehicles. They need to space people out more. All of that just makes it even worse for them from an economic perspective. So we need, and on, transit is so critical. It's a safety net for so many of our people. And from economically, they play a hugely important role in cities like San Francisco and Washington and New York and Chicago and Philadelphia. So we really need to help transit. But I think we need to help them in a way that they are able to do a better job in being responsive to these equity concerns and innovating more and partnering with some of these mobility companies and including micro mobility we haven't talked about, but the scooters and bikes, and make them part of the system, make it more of a multimodal system. So I'd like to see, so they're definitely going to bail out transit, I'm sure of that, but I'd like to see them do a lot of it, but in a way that really helps the transit industry become much bigger and stronger. More capacity, more integrated, more partnerships. And in many ways, that might even, in some ways that might be a top priority going forward, that and electrification.
I think that's a good way to end on a hopeful, optimistic tone. It's been a heck of a year. And so, we're nearing the end finally. So hopefully 2021 will be brighter skies for all of us. At least cleaner skies, right? More EVs. So we're going to wrap up. Dan, thank you so much for joining me on the show. Hope to have you again on soon. Anything last you want to leave the audience with?
No, just that, this is such a transformational time. I just hosted a meeting with some senior executives from government and industry for my institute. And we all went around the table virtually and just noted the car industry, the electric utilities, the energy industries, universities, local governments, state government, we're all going through such a transformational stage. And for transportation, it's so exciting because we are seeing so much innovation available now being, taken up. And so there is more than, certainly in my life, certainly in half a century, more opportunity to do good now than the last half century. So, that's what I tell my grad students, and because really this is exciting and important, and we really can really do good for everyone.
More positive, optimistic tones from Mr. Sperling. Wonderful. All right. Well, thanks again. And we're going to wrap it up. And look for this online shortly on YouTube and your favorite podcast subscription services. And we'll do another episode soon. Thanks again. Thanks, Dan.
Well, thank you. Been a pleasure.